Hi, this is Paul. I want to continue in this series on the default matrix of Western religions. I forgot to put the Z on the end there. There, that's fixed. I began this with a video on non-coercion. And you can find that. I'll put the link. Well, it'll be in the playlist. I created a new playlist, I think, for this. And if I didn't, I'll create it for this video. I hope to remember. What is religion? Multiple definitions of the word overlapping. Secularity sort of has boxed it in. The broadest definition is your religion defines, describes, depends on what is highest, propositional perspectival. Your religion is how you pursue what is highest, participatory and procedural. Now, the last video we talked about boomorality, or the principle of non-coercion, and how that is deeply embedded in our culture and our psyche in the religion about what we see as making things work, what we see as the highest values, the highest aspiration, and how to achieve it. And non-coercion nicely is both the ideal we pursue and the means by which we pursue it, sort of. We don't, I find people like non-coercion as an ideal, but when they get scared or nervous, they default to coercion. And that is both in the church and outside the church. The deep tie binding spouse of non-coercion in the matrix of default religions in our culture is what I call progressive liberationism. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I thought that was nicely summed up in I don't remember the Jenner who made the defunct Pepsi ad, but that tremendously good tweet. Hold my wig, Keisha. I got some liberating to do. To which is respond, it's Jennifer. This is deep and pervasive in our culture, and one of the deep, powerful prophets of this was Voltaire. It is big in the Enlightenment, and it is such a powerful spirit, trope, movement thingy that, in fact, we're just sort of reaching the end of it now, and we'll talk a little bit about the roots of it. So Voltaire mastered or was mastered by it, depending on to what degree these things are spirits that we are living in the world with. The narrative is so easy and obvious and so absolutely pervasive in so many movies, so many stories. I would have to say that as through much of my life, this was a dominant part of my religious matrix. And this is where sort of it will bump into its perennial enemy as it sees, which is movement conservatism. And we'll have to talk about movement conservatism going forward too. The narrative is easy, and I think it's deeply tied and akin to the subtraction story. The subtraction story that Charles Taylor pointed out in his book, A Secular Age, where they're just sort of imagine that the past was tyrannical, patriarchal, all these elements of sincerity culture. And you can really add sort of the postmodern flavor to it, that all of this power, all of these spirits, all of these institutions, all of this systemic stuff in the world before whatever I see as breakthroughs, whether it be women's suffrage or the civil rights movement or the Stonewall riots or whatever was before sort of the liberation that happened was all mean men, terrible religion, religious institutions, all of the baddies sort of binding, imprisoning, enslaving, suppressing the natural goodness. There's, of course, a lot of Rousseau in here. The natural goodness of people, that if you just release people from the constraints of systemic stuff or authoritarian stuff or institutional stuff or traditional XYZ or cultures of sincerity, then suddenly humans are liberated. Now, this is progressive liberation because in sort of a Hegelian sense, in sort of a Marxist sense, it sort of goes through history, and it's just we're increasingly being liberated from all of these old bad things. And so it's sort of like postmillennialism, that things are going to get better and better and better and better. It's deeply eschatological, that things are just going to continue to improve. The myth of progress is deeply associated with it. It's such a pervasive narrative that it is all over the place. Religions, kings, men, everything was looking to keep you down. You need to break the shackles of these forces, or ally with people who are breaking the shackles for others. And this is, of course, where this Jenner's liberationist participation in the Pepsi movement ad was such a marker. April 4, 2017. It was a little while ago that that the thing happened. You need to break the shackles of these forces, or ally with those who do, by liberating people from, sometimes it's the internal no, it's the internalized oppression that's inside of me. It's the law. Protestantism, of course, Lutheranism was big in terms of law and gospel. From the man, another biggie in the 70s and 80s, from church authority, from racism, sexism, homophobia, hatred, any sort of systemic oppression or systemic liberation. People need to be liberated from this, and if they're liberated from this, then everything will be grand. Good people liberate, bad people say no or participate in the no. It's the basic narrative. I almost don't even need to spell it out. This has been so worked on, especially, let's say, by red pill communities, that it almost goes without saying. Now, it is a religion, and it does have this religious quality because, of course, the idea of freedom from, of liberation from, is enticing. And there's just this internal whoosh that develops, and we can see it, we can participate in it. And the highest ideal is that we can do anything. Now, this, of course, C.S. Lewis deals with a bit in The Great Divorce, when, in fact, the Gray City, where the story starts, is a city where you can have anything you want just by imagining and thinking of it. If you can think it, you can have it. But, of course, the city is perpetually moving out, or with bigger and bigger and grander houses, because the one thing that nobody can actually tolerate is anybody else's no, because the vision sort of can't quite deal with the fact that there continues to exist certain zero-sum situations where my liberation means somebody else's pain, and maybe even subjugation. That the world isn't such a thing that everything, the world isn't such a simplistic place that all you have to do is free something, and then suddenly eschatology happens. The world is not that way. But the idea of progressive liberation has this religious vision of complete liberation and freedom. And the path is a breaking of power, but it usually also uses power and is not necessarily adverse to violence. You can see this in, let's say, a lot of narratives around the American Civil War, where, originally, well, how did the war start? Was it really a war about slavery? Well, slavery was certainly a piece of it. There were multiple factors in it, but of course, Lincoln, in his Emancipation Proclamation, only re-emancipated the slaves in the rebel states and not the border slave states, and which led to people saying where he could, he wouldn't, and where he wouldn't, and where he couldn't, he would, in terms of the Emancipation Proclamation. So, but there's just all of these narratives of the good use of violence, the good use of power. And you see this, it's a trope in American movies that the hero is reluctant to use violence, and so the hero sort of reduces and gives a non-terminal lethal defeat against the enemy, thus achieving the liberation. But then the enemy, because he's evil, even in a place of losing, has one more attempt to sort of leash back, and then the hero must, because there are no other means, must now kill the enemy, the oppressor, the slaver, the person who binds, must kill that so that this person can no longer bind anyone. And so you sort of have the good and bad man in Liberty Valance, where John Wayne kills Liberty Valance. And this is just a trope in American movies. Americans like to see themselves as reluctantly using violence only when at the utter need, at the other reaches of necessity, will Americans use violence. A lot of the rest of the world sort of says, really? That's what you think about yourselves? But that's deeply into this. There's often the liberation has to be self-done. We have to save ourselves. We have to liberate ourselves. And again, movies are rich in this, where wives liberate themselves from their husbands, and adult children liberate themselves from their tyrannical parents. And I mean, again, American part of what makes Hollywood so powerful is it's so liberationist. And liberation is one of the feelings that we get that is so good and so desirable and often so wonderful. The freeing of the slaves. We love liberation, and in many cases that liberation should happen. And I'm going to talk about how this is very much a downstream from Christianity, and this is a product of Christianity in our culture. Sometimes liberating others even against their will. And so I post fairly often on Twitter little homeless sagas, and this is something that, like, the state of California, the spirit of the state of California is dealing with now. To what degree, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, California passed a lot of legislation that made it pretty impossible to permanently consign someone to a mental hospital, let's say. And so what that led to is a lot of legislation that you're basically free to be crazy here. And as long as you don't hurt anyone, and by hurt anyone, we mean do something to the degree that it would cause the police to come and see that you victimize someone with bleeding or blunt force trauma or perhaps hurt property. So the whole element of harm is a big line in this thing too. And so, to what degree must we involuntarily commit someone so we can get the drugs out of their system and keep them from drugs, and maybe give them antipsychotic medication so that they will see the world differently? And maybe if we can temporarily break the bondage of drugs or mental illness by our services and our therapy, then they can once again be liberated and free to do things. And again, this is not a bad narrative. It's something that we all want to do, and many of us will have narratives in our own life of, someone showed me the light, and then I walked out into the light, and I was liberated. Now, non-coercion is a value, but violated with justification for a greater good, such as liberation. It's that potent an element of our default religion. This sort of combines with a faith in technology, because people have noticed that a lot of our powerful liberations have come via technology. That, women have been released from the drudgery of clothes washing by the washing machine. And now that electricity is present, we can go to sleep when we want and wake up when we want. And electricity can power my cameras and my computers and washing machines, and we have gasoline cars, and so and we have contraception and medical, modern medicine. And so this very much sort of helps enhance and empower a religious imagination of liberation that, someday we'll cure cancer, and someday we'll cure Alzheimer's. And all of this is just deeply liberationist. We're looking to have these things, to be liberated from these things that bind us, because sometimes we're bound by other people. Sometimes we're bound by diseases. Sometimes we're bound by this or that. Liberations might feel impractical now, but our imagines that one day it will be practical. And with additional technology, someday our prince will come. Now, in some ways, the big baddie, the big enemy of progressive liberationism is what I would say is movement conservatism. And that's sort of how the major fronts of the culture war are seen today on both sides. I've been listening carefully to people talk about conservatives. And so when people say conservatives in sort of an appreciative light, that's what I call movement conservatism. And movement conservatism is sort of here to butt up against progressive liberationism. Now, most movement conservatives, especially in our context, are fundamentally liberal, and there's a deep relationship between progressive liberationism and, let's say, classical liberalism. So many movement conservatives are liberal, but they say there needs to be ends, there needs to be bounds on progressive liberationism. Of course, Jordan Peterson's famous question, when does the left go too far? That's sort of a sense of saying, okay, movement conservatism is going to put bounds. And then, of course, you've got Doug Wilson and that whole tribe with, no enemies to the right. And it's like, really? Now, progressive liberationism is definitely downstream from Christianity and Protestantism. The Exodus story is deeply liberational. Obviously, the slaves are free. And if you get into Jordan Peterson's Exodus series, which has a lot of movement conservatives in it, it in fact might be, I don't want to necessarily categorize everyone in there, but almost all of them would be movement conservatives. Daily Wire is a picture of movement conservatism. That I would say in some ways that is sort of the main thing that Daily Wire tries to embody is movement conservatism. And so it's deep, obviously, in the Abrahamic religions in many ways. The Exodus story is one of liberation, but then they have to go into the desert because it's one thing to get Israel out of Egypt. It's another thing to get Egypt out of Israel. And of course, the desert wanderings are designed to do that, and they're given a new culture, and they're going to given a land, but they have to follow the covenant. And so there's a ton of that going on. The Protestant Reformation is often seen in this light too, because of course Jan Hus was burned at the stake, and Martin Luther was not burned at the stake. And so the printing press is a tool of liberation, and theology is a tool of liberation. Of course, Luther had not nature grace, but rather law, gospel, a fairly hard antithesis between law and gospel in a lot of, or at least some Lutheran theologies. So the Protestant Reformation very much set up a liberationist narrative. And now some, of course, magisterial Protestants, someone might mention Servetus, executed by Calvin's Geneva. The difficulty with state power is that it's a difficult thing for zealots of many varieties to say no to. Not now to, no to. But this is, again, big narrative. So then, of course, sort of Baptists can use this narrative against anti-Baptists. Anabaptists can use this narrative against just about anyone. Anabaptists, in some ways, really, Anabaptists, Quakers, a variety of elements of the Radical Reformation really embody sort of this progressive liberationism, as do, let's say, the Transcendentalists, the New England Transcendentalists. And I think, I should maybe talk to Sam about this. I'm sure, there's a deep vein of this in religious liberty, Unitarianism, because they, of course, were the victims of lots of Trinitarians during even the post-Reformation period. We mentioned Servetus. So there are deep roots in this. And again, to name something like progressive liberationism, progressive liberation is a particular variant of, let's say, these broad liberationist themes that run through the Bible, they run through the church, they run through Jesus. Jesus sets the captives free. Of course, the African-American slaves picked up on this, very much saw the liberational power of Christianity. The civil rights movement very much trades in it. All of the rights movements trade in this. But of course, what sort of happens is that rights movements sort of become progressive liberationists, and then because it's so powerful in our culture, and there's so much agreement in our culture, and our culture is sort of deeply saturated with it. It's sort of it's sort of an ever-present potential reserve that once people sort of hit liberationist themes, people will automatically be moved to them. It is such a powerful theme in our culture. Now, in my conversation with Bob, I'm starting to release some little clips from it, but in my conversation with Bob, one of the interesting things that I think Bob, when he noticed that in the early teens, watching American media, I think this is part of what Putin fears. Totalitarian governments really fear this because it is such a potent thing. Of course, it comes in the American Revolution. The American Revolution is sort of mobilized by this, and it is such a potent thing. And I think part of what is being played out in, let's say, the Ukraine-Russia thing is that the West at least sees this as a war of liberation, that there needs to be liberation from tyranny, and again, deeply American themes. This is deep in the matrix of Western values of liberty. As also Bob talked about in the video, Jesus' non-coercive posture with respect to, let's say, traditional messianism in the story of Israel, which of course is David liberating Israel from the Philistines and from all of the surrounding neighbors. The Maccabees liberating the Judeans, creating the Hasmonean dynasty from the Seleucids and the Greeks, and of course the culture war going on during Jesus' time, where there are a variety of groups. Zealots are trying to kill Romans. They're sort of a violent revolution. Pharisees are sort of a cultural revolt. Essenes are sort of a withdraw, wait into the cave and let God nuke them response. The aristocracy is much more, the Roman way is clearly the right way. It's much more of, let's say, a perennialist approach. Now, some perennialists will recoil at that because, of course, what has happened in the American religious matrix is that liberationism is so deep, many perennialists are also liberationists and non-coercionists. And you can see that even among some Christian perennialists. And I think this is a deep theme beneath beneath ideas of universalism that are, this is where lines get so crossed, because on one hand, you can very easily see connections between movement conservatism and sort of the orthodox revival or orthodox movement happening in America, orthodox surge happening in American culture today and in the West. So in some ways, that orthodox surge is sort of like movement conservatism, and this is where I get into my metagelicalism idea, because you've got orthodox surge people that are also aligned with movement conservatives like Rod Dreher, and you've got some of that, but then you've got this interesting strain of non-coercive universalism. And when you look at, say, Paul Kingsnorth's against civilizational Christianity, a lot of non-coercionists and really ardent, consistent non-coercionists tend to be against civilizational anything because civilization entails a degree of either active coercion or passive coercion, depending on sort of how your liberationist matrix is fleshed out. So there you can sort of see the tensions between Paul Kingsnorth's non-coercion and Rod Dreher's civilizationalism. But of course, Dreher is sort of on the bubble with his Benedict option. And you can just see with these different individuals, watch some of these spirits tugging and, going back and forth with these different individuals. But you can see it also obviously in some universalisms where Miroslav Volf points a lot of this out with exclusion and embrace. I mean, will God somehow finally not coerce, But to what degree is influence coercion? I mean, there's some subtleties and nuances in there, because part of when you start going deep into this, you start getting to difficult questions like exactly what is the will, and is there will, and freedom of the will, and real agency, and all of these issues. The deeper down you go, you start bumping into this when you start talking about, well, I'm against coercion. Well, what about influence? What about rhetoric? Isn't rhetoric sort of like cheating coercion? Sneaky influence? I mean, you go down deep enough and these questions get super, super murky and difficult, because the nuances get finer and finer. And then the questions about, well, how do they actually manifest up at this level of sort of human-sized levels gets pretty difficult. But Jesus very clearly was working a non-coercive revolution, a very patient revolution, and a revolution which would, in time, bear fruit in the Roman Empire. But then, of course, once non-coercion sort of gets to a civilizational level, then suddenly you have questions about, well, what about internalized non-coercion? And I mean, things just start to get really weird the deeper down you go as you start thinking through these questions. But culturally, this has, of course, been sort of a cutting edge that the culture has been on. And we're reaching the borders of progressive liberationism as we struggle with some of these questions. Are we really, by sticking hard to non-coercion with respect to people who are obviously under the power of certain mental illnesses or certain substance abuses, to what degree are they free? And so, like I said, you get down deep enough and all of the definitions of these words start to get murky, because they all start bumping up against themselves, especially when you get to try to apply them in the human-sized narratives where our action has to take place. So, then you have, of course, the rise of the authoritarian left, where you have speech codes and tone policing and all of these other things. It's like, hey, what happened to non-coercion? You're policing my tone, and this is where you get a lot of these culture war flashpoints. Now, there's, again, a deep eschatology that's getting worked here, and part of the irony that we see working is that the liberationisms are running into certain ends, one of which is anxiety, let's say, over ecological collapse and environmental concerns. And again, Kingsnorth is an interesting critter in this, because he's if you listen to his Against Christian Civilizational speech, a lot of what's operating beneath the surface there is a lot of liberationism and a lot of non-coercion, which is why Bethel McGrew, just recently wrote a piece. I was reading a lot of Bethel's stuff over the Christmas holiday. When people call Paul Kingsnorth a hippie, it's a lot of this, okay? Because when people feel the liberationism and the non-coercion, that to them starts to, in sort of a language model like Matrix, starts pushing them towards, oh, I'm identifying them with the left, I'm identifying them with hippies. And, of course, Dreer is a super complex creature. Of course, part of what broke Dreer from certain elements of movement conservatism was, of course, the neocons and the Gulf War. So there's a lot of stuff going on at play here. But ironically, a lot of people who are very much in the progressive liberation camp are now no longer free to have children. And this is where you get these inversions where progressive liberation gets to a certain point and it's losing its liberationist value. And now I remember before I started doing videos, I was watching this website, Everyday Feminism. That was the name of the website. I've mentioned it on the channel sometimes in early places, because this is like the early 20-teens in the CRC, and I'm watching this in people around me, and so then I stumble across this. I'm watching people post things from everyday feminism. And the more I read everyday feminism, the more it seemed like even if you're going to follow the 613 laws in the Pentateuch, everyday feminism's laws and rules are way more binding than traditionalism. And I think, and this is exactly where this moment is right now, that progressive liberation is getting to a point that people are liberating themselves from progressive liberationism into cultures of sincerity and certain traditionalisms, because they are actually finding more freedom within certain commitments and communities and boundaries. And again, this sort of gets back into, themes that many Orthodox are promoting, such as the curbing of the passions, because once we are liberated sufficiently from various externalities that we've identified in history, then suddenly we realize we are bound from the inside. And so liberation looks like monasticism or asceticism or the boundaries of a community. But again, in our culture of non-coercion, I first have to voluntarily join this monastic community for them to rightly place these bounds upon me. So you see all of this. Paul Kingsnorth, interestingly enough, in the Against Christian Civilization speech, talks about inversions, but I think the inversions are a key element to Christianity that gives it its cultural power to really impact, infiltrate, sneak, and non-coercively take up residence in other culture to help people work through these inversions. And if you listen to Jonathan Peugeot in the gospel seminars, you see him continuing to do these inversions, and you see Vervaeke seeing Peugeot do these inversions, and Vervaeke pointing them out in the gospel seminar tapes, where you're doing this inversion again, Jonathan. You're doing this inversion again, Jonathan. So whereas Christians will look at some inversions and say, no, that's not a good one, but this one is a good one, inversion itself, I think, is a Christian superpower. Well, my intent for this was not to make this a super long video, so I think I will draw it here because there's some more videos I want to make. I'm continuing to play with things like video length and video style and video types. And I know you'll have some people, some of you love longer videos and some of you love shorter videos, but this video is what it is. So leave a comment.